camera as well. Yeah, feel free to rotate this, Colleen, if you want to. Yeah, and then here's.
Thanks, everyone. And over to Colleen to start us off.
Okay, so thanks, Chris, Helen, Emma, and Esther for inviting me to this workshop and inviting me to speak. I've been given the task of summarising environmental drivers of infectious diseases and eco-epidemiology all in about 12 minutes. So it's going to be a really broad overview just to set the scene for today. And I think we have a lot more, detailed talks later on by other speakers. So my background is in medicine, public health, epidemiology, infectious diseases. So I'm not a modeler and I'm not an environmental scientist, but I work with a lot of them and really interested in this space and multidisciplinary collaborations. So I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. So firstly, what do we mean by emerging infectious diseases? And a lot of people, when they hear this term, they just think about new novel pathogens. And that's one of the things, but there are lots of other things that fall into this space of emerging infectious diseases. So things that are evolving over time, things that are increasing in incidence, expanding in geographic distribution, changing populations that are at risk, and changing drivers of transmission. So anything that's changing can be considered as emerging in terms of changing epidemiology. So there are a whole range of different emerging infectious diseases. So
Sorry, Colleen, the slides aren't advancing for the Zoom folks. So I'm just going to see if we can get that fixed.
So I'll put a big screen up there now. So we have mosquito-borne diseases, we have food-borne diseases, respiratory infections, zoonotic diseases, environmentally driven things, especially climate change and extreme weather, flooding, etc. And people can also become infected through different activities, including recreational activities, things at home, things at work. So it's a very broad range of diseases. And maybe it's working for them, but let's try this one. Let's see how we go.
I might be able to use the arrows here for now. Sorry about that.
Emerging infectious diseases are not rare things. So this is just a, you don't need to read anything there, but these are emerging infectious disease events that were tracked by the WHO between 2011 and 2018. And there were something like 1,400 of these epidemics in 72 countries. So epidemics are not new and pandemics are not new. And so these are some of the dramatic examples of outbreaks that we've seen in recent years. So long before the current pandemic, we've had many different outbreaks that have affected millions of people around the world. So the current one has brought everything into more attention, but really these are not new, and people have been predicting pandemics for a long time. And a lot of the emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin. So Ricardo, I think we'll talk about that later on, so I won't really go too much into that. But this concept of One Health, I think all of you are familiar with that, the links between humans, animals, and the environment. And there are many different diagrams showing all of these links. This is quite a nice one, showing not just the links between those three things, but all the different drivers that affect each of those three things, as well as the interactions between them. So if you look closely, you can see things like urbanization, deforestation, which of course affects biodiversity, globalization, travel and tourism, changes in population densities and population growth. So a lot of different drivers, both related to the natural environment and the human environment. So there are long lists of these things which you guys are probably very familiar with, but they're all very much interlinked, and some are more naturally focused, others are more anthropogenically focused, but they drive each other. And so human activities are the most potent drivers of disease emergence and outbreaks. So some of the most important ones are population growth, globalization, which includes some movement of people and travel. So that multicolored map there shows, you know, the transport hubs and clusters and how connected people are. And as you can see from the current pandemic, things can spread around the world extremely quickly. There's social demographic change, and then all the impacts of all of this on the natural environment and ecology. And a big thing for all of this is climate change. So there's been a recent series of papers in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, looking at climate change and infectious diseases. And it's quite a cool, funky thing. There's lots of interactive things you can click on in there. But essentially, if you look at the orange circle at the top, that's climate change. And the bottom right there, you've got some infectious diseases and deaths and all the different links between the drivers of infectious disease transmission, either directly or indirectly related to climate change. And biodiversity, which is what we're talking about today, is smack in the middle of that. So if you look at the changes in socio-ecological systems, that's, you know, has a huge impact on biodiversity. And this diagram is very much focused on vector-borne diseases. So of course there are other things like zoonotic diseases and other types of infectious diseases. So this is the interactive version, and all of those things on the boxes on the side are potential intervention strategies, which you can't see easily here. But in this sort of more static version, we can have a look at the interventions that I've highlighted as being important for us to really think about. So, of course, you know, mitigating climate change and emissions are important. That's at the top. Increasing funding, which, you know, we all know is important, but recognise and frame the problem with a transdisciplinary lens, which is why we're all here today. Decision support and analytics has been highlighted as something that's really important. Enhanced use of environmental information and building human capacity in data management, integrated surveillance, and of course leadership. So integrated surveillance, I think, is something we've talked about for quite a long time, and I know, Ricardo, it's one of your interests, but actually operationalising it is much more difficult than it would seem. So this paper, this series of paper also highlighted a number of key knowledge gaps for climate change and infectious diseases. One is location, so being able to, you know, identify areas that are at high risk, looking at changes over time, and also the impact of extreme events. So those are the things that we really don't understand very well. So I encourage you to have a look at that series of papers. It's you know, really well written and interesting. So eco-epidemiology, I think a lot of you will be familiar with that. What it is, it's a concept that takes into account the interplay between natural, economic, social, and social systems. And importantly, it operates at multiple scales. Okay, so we go from molecular to microbiological to individual, household, community, global sort of level. So really important to think about it at different scales. And it really requires this integrated and multidisciplinary approach and collaborations. And really importantly, it acknowledges the complex interactions in these very dynamic systems, which of course is, you know, really complicated. And in all the associated uncertainty, unpredictability, instability, and also recognises the interdependence of forces, which are often treated independently. So similar concepts like environmental epidemiology, eco-health, One Health, planetary health, all fall into this space. And one of the things that are really important in eco-epidemiology is place. So the three key elements in epidemiology are time, place, and person. So it changes for these three things. But the key components of place, which we need to think about, not just the natural environment, but the anthropological environment and things like vectors and people's mobility. So place is not static, people move around, and so places are interlinked. And so with place, apart from those things we've just mentioned, there's also biodiversity loss, which of course is variable over space. So it's really important to consider place and spatial variation when we talk about eco-epidemiology. So these are the sort of scales you might want to think about, and the pressures and drivers also operate differently at different scales and may influence each other across scales. So this is just an example of a study we did some years ago in Fiji on leptospirosis, which is zoonotic disease, and examples of how you might collect data at different scales. So you can collect information from the person, but you can also use spatial epidemiology to integrate data on environment and different covariates. So just some examples of tools that we've used within our team in eco-epidemiology research. I'm going to race through these and not actually talk about the studies because we don't have time. But one of the key things is spatial epidemiology, and I know quite a few people in this room have really good skills with that, much better than mine. But this allows us to link place when we're looking at eco-epidemiology. But we can also use spatial epidemiology together with other tools. So people are quite familiar with things like logistic regression, for example. So this is something that Helen and I did with others, looking at geographically weighted regression, so that we can predict and not just make a predictive risk map, but look at variations in drivers over space. So that map on the left shows variations in odds ratios of all the different drivers. And so that's really important when we want to be a bit more precise about what's driving transmission in different locations. Then Bayesian networks, I think that's used a lot in environmental sciences and ecology, but we're exploring the use of that in public health and infectious diseases. It's much better than public health methods for dealing with complex systems. And it's also useful for scenario analysis and being able to interactively explore scenarios. So we've used that for some of our studies, and also linking spatial epidemiology to Bayesian networks to produce spatial Bayesian networks. So stuff that, again, Helen and I have worked on together. And when we talk about movement of people, animals, goods, vectors around the world, it's important to also understand connections between places, so such as network analysis. So this is something we did recently with Angela, one of my postdocs in the team, looking at how connected places are and how an infectious disease might spread, the probability that it will spread from A to B, and the patterns of spread. And this is focused on the Pacific Islands, but of course it could be done that for elsewhere. Mathematical modeling techniques used to predict changes over time. So this is work that we've done with lymphatic filariasis elimination, mosquito-borne disease, and again, linking spatial epidemiology with an agent-based mathematical model to look at what would happen over time. And this gives us much more detail than the standard SIR type models that don't take into account interactions between people or agents within the model. And even machine learning. So this is again related to lymphatic filariasis. This is Helen's work again, looking at using machine learning to identify residual hotspots of transmission. So again, a big component of space and geostatistics in that. And then looking more at the micro level, pathogen genomics, as we all know from this current pandemic, are really useful for tracking the spread of pathogens and seeing how things move from A to B, person to person, etc. It can also be used for environmental tracking. So those are just some of the methods we've used, but there are lots of other methods, and some of the things include predictive analytics, early warning systems, better integration of information systems and data systems. I think are really key. We're looking at integrating information from different disciplines, integrate assessments as well, and environmental modeling, system dynamics, and being able to actually communicate this information, engage stakeholders and end users through data visualization, interactive tools, decision support tools. So these are just, this is not an exhaustive list, but it'd be really good to, explore some of these methods with others in the room this afternoon during the workshops to see if we can, bring in methods that are much more commonly used in other disciplines compared to public health, so that we can, do things in a different way and try and advance, what we've been doing, and rather than doing the same old thing we did the last 20, 30 years, to try and move things forward. So that's, I think that's my 15 minutes. And thanks everyone for your attention. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. It's just a whirlwind overview, but Helen, you can let me know if there's time for questions.